How did you discover that you were a writer?
Oh gosh, that's a hard question right off the bat. I think it wasn't so much that I thought of myself as a writer as much as I was just writing all the time. I wrote a lot as a kid. I was always writing poetry. I was writing stories. I was just kind of making stuff. And then people were kind of telling me I was a writer, and it was like, oh, you're a writer. You write things. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I am. I guess I relate to that. That makes sense. But I think it was kind of a gradual process where I was just doing the thing and I was making stuff that I found interesting, and somewhere along the line I was a writer, and it just already happened.
Have you always written stories for fun?
For a while I did. I think when I was younger I was just all about making things, and in my teen years I wrote a lot, and I wrote fan fiction and just kind of whatever came to my mind. I had stuff to say, and I went to college and I studied journalism in college, and I started doing more professional writing, and I kind of thought oh, I'm not any good at fiction. I'm going to do this other stuff. I'm going to be an editorial writer and go that route. And it didn't make me happy, and I wasn't really in love with the job, and eventually I quit, and I was like, okay, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do writing professionally. I'm going to do something else. And then somewhere along the line, I think it was a little before 2020 and the pandemic, I came across Wattpad, the website, and everyone was just kind of doing that free form writing like I did when I was younger that I really enjoyed. And I kind of got back into it, and it was like, oh, I could just do this for fun. I could just do what I'd like to do. It doesn't have to be, commercial, sellable, whatever it may be. I can just start making again. And it kind of came full circle to where all of a sudden the fact that I was making things that people liked, it just kind of came out of nowhere, and it kind of came back around. I was like, oh, I guess I'm writing again.
What joy do you get out of writing?
Oh, I think there's this kind of playful thing that we all kind of have, especially, when you're a kid and you're playing with dolls or anything like that, where we all like telling stories and make believe. And for me, writing has become my adult outlet for that creative need to kind of act things out and see what happens. It's kind of like experimentation, where you can think oh, I'm putting these two characters together. What are they going to do? How are they going to interact? And I frequently will just be sitting there thinking okay, what if they do this? And then I'll just rerun the scene and be like, I'm going to do it again. Now this time, this person's here. Does this change it? And it's that kind of pure joy and willingness to play and experiment that I think is really powerful about what can come from writing. And I think on top of that, I also really love the connection I get with my readers. And I can tell stories about chronically ill people. I can tell stories about various levels of disability and people who are queer, and I will get people kind of reaching out saying, oh, I really felt seen. I really felt valued by the way this character was portrayed. And that is also just really gratifying for me.
How did you decide you wanted to become a professional writer?
Yeah, I think, it did kind of come at me. And I think I had a little bit of a break there where I thought I didn't want to be a professional writer. And I think the way that I kind of rediscovered that interest was because I realized I could do it in a way that was true to me and what I wanted to create. And there was, I think initially, especially when you're fresh out of college and you have these ideas of being, the next great American writer, you want to be, something, magical, and you want to be literature. And I thought I wanted that. And then when I really started making things that I enjoy, I realized like, oh, I don't want that. I'm not the kind of person who even necessarily reads great literature. I mean, sometimes I do, but a lot of times I like, I like romance. I like, paranormal stuff. I like fantasy stuff. I like, indulging kind of whatever my brain wants at that moment. And sometimes it's fluffy and fun. And I see a lot of value in that as a reader. So for me, it took me a while to realize that there is value in that from the writer perspective, and that I can write that way and affect people in that way. And I don't have to be great literature. I don't have to be, this highbrow concept of what, some people think of as, a great writer, that I can write what makes me happy, what I enjoy, what other people can find joy in. And for me, that made more sense as a career than something like, being the great American author. That sounds like a good career on paper, but for me, it didn't fit me. What did fit me was, talking about queer issues and disability and working those into fun concepts like romance, and finding a space for these underrepresented people in the romance world. That fit me as a person, and I feel like that was more appealing as a profession than just kind of this broad sense of, what an author is and what an author looks like.
Sure. So the concept of an author at first seemed attractive, and then maybe you changed your mind on it and then rediscovered it again?
Yeah, I think there's this kind of, romantic notion of, someone sitting at a typewriter in an old cabin kind of thing, and like, oh, that's a writer. And, to some degree, you see how society values that. You see how there's a lot of value placed on being important and saying important things and having an important mind. And I think I saw that as the ideal. And then when I tried it, I didn't like it. And I was like, oh, I don't enjoy this at all. This isn't good for me, but it also isn't using my talents well. And when I kind of redefined, an author doesn't have to look like that. A lot of the authors that I love that have written things that really fascinate me and have captivated my interest, like, they're not that way. They're not, the old man with a typewriter in a cabin. That's not the reality for most people. And when I kind of redefined in my mind that picture, it was like, oh, I want to be that. I want to be, the wild, queer writer who's comfortable talking about difficult things and, makes people feel seen and, isn't afraid of, tropes and cliches and, can kind of appreciate the full breadth of what writing is, and not just that little niche of highbrow lit.
Right, and there's also been a lot of films that show writers, that sort of cliche writer, becoming unhinged from isolation and just drinking too much. We just saw one with Aubrey Plaza that was great, where she kind of rescues this old writer, and it wasn't so glamorous to the outside world. Maybe they thought it was.
Yeah, I think it's kind of that, it's romanticized but not glamorous. It's, you kind of, I think that's how we perceive genius. I think that's how we perceive this grand intellect, is that, you're alone and miserable and, working for hours on end in your workshop and nobody sees you for days, sort of thing. And when you really look at it, it's like, well, who wants that? Nobody wants that. But there is an appeal because you want to be recognized. You want people to, connect with your work, and you think, oh, that's what society views as, valuable in the writing world, is that person who is, the chaotic genius who is isolated and maybe, losing their mind slowly. And I think realistically that's not true. There's so much that people do value beyond that. And it's just that there's this stereotype of, this kind of cookie cutter idea of the tortured writer. And it makes for interesting movies, but it's not necessarily what writers look like in real life.
Excellent. Great.
Excellent.
That's great. Yeah, I don't listen to Taylor Swift, but I don't know what the tortured poets thing is. I want to delve more into it. I haven't, but is that sort of what it's about, or?
I will happily talk about Taylor
Oh,
Swift.
you will? Okay, yeah. 'Cause isn't that sort of the trope that she's like?
That is, yeah. I really like the new album. I find it really fascinating, and she's always been a really phenomenal writer, and I always like following her works, and especially her lyrics. And she does talk about being a tortured poet, and the title song on her new album is basically kind of poking fun at she and this presumably boyfriend kind of acting like tortured poets and being serious dramatic artists, and how they're, you know, he left behind his typewriter, and she's like, what are we doing? You know, we're adults. We're just, you know, like we're trying so hard to be something we're not. We're trying to be this archetype. And, you know, maybe it seems glamorous as a thought, but when you're actually living it and dissecting it, it's like, that's not who anyone wants to be.
Right. And being out in the world does feed work. You know, there's been classic sort of examples of people that they've been able to quit their day job, but then they don't have that material to feed their imagination anymore because you're just in this vacuum. So what challenges have you faced from writing for fun to then earning a living with your writing?
You know, I think I've been pretty lucky in that they do tend to coincide for me. I think the more fun I'm having, the more my readers like what I'm writing. And I think if anything, I've taken that sense of having fun and I use it as a barometer for how well my story is going. And so if I'm, you know, really miserable and I'm like, I just don't know how to write this part, it's not coming off right, I tend to take a step back and be like, well, if I'm not having fun, is my reader going to be having fun? Like, if I don't want to write it, does someone want to read it? And oftentimes the answer is no. You know, there's a reason that I'm stumbling. There's a reason that the fun has kind of stopped. And it's like, you know, when I hit that point, to me, it's just a sign that, okay, something's not working, revisit this section or rewrite it or cut it entirely, because a lot of times the things that aren't fun to write are the filler scenes, the scenes that like, oh, need to happen to connect one thing to the next. And if I can find a clever way to remove those and just be like, you know, if I can just have one line in the next scene where someone just explains that this happened, I don't have to include all this. And, you know, it kind of flows better. So I think I've been very lucky that the stuff that I find fun to write is the stuff that people do want to pay for and want to read. And my readers are fantastic and they're incredibly supportive. And I'm very lucky on that front. But it's also, now I see that it is indicative of whether or not it's going to work, is whether or not I'm having fun.
How long does it take to write a book that's 100,000 words?
Oh gosh. So, I mean, it really depends. I think for me, any particular book tends to take around a year. I've known some writers who just like, bam, you know, they're done in, you know, a couple months. And I've never been that person. I don't, that's magic to me. And then I know other writers who like, they'll take, you know, 3 years to write a book. And for me, I've found that for whatever reason, I've written books that are more on the like 80,000 end, and then I've written books that are way higher, like on the, you know, 140,000. And it always seems to be about a year. I think it's just kind of roughly how fast my brain works through kind of a plot rather than the actual like word count. For me, it tends to always be about a year. I don't know why.
Where does your process begin?
Oh, funny enough, I think it begins with a lot of chaotic notes on my phone. I'll start with some sort of vague idea, and it's usually because I've seen something that like, oh, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. If it's in a movie or a book or, you know, old mythology, it could be kind of anything. And I start on a concept and then I kind of see what's being done. And a lot of times what I think it's going to be, it ends up going in a different direction and they didn't take it the way I wanted it, or they didn't do what I thought they were going to do with it. And I was like, oh, well, why not? Someone should do that. And so I'll, you know, write something down briefly on my phone. I'll be like, oh, you know, something about, you know, like an alien or like whatever it'll be. I'll have some sort of vague concept and I'll be like, oh, or, you know, this interesting idea for a superpower or whatever. And it will be the first note and I will just make it real brief. And then something else will come to me about that same idea. And I go back to that note and I kind of just like type something in like, oh, you could add this too. And that would be interesting. And by the time I finish whatever my current project is, I usually have at least one note that is just really long. And I'm like, oh, there's a story here. Like I've got a ton of bits and pieces. And then I go through from there and I try to actually kind of organize the notes. And so sometimes it's things like chronological order, but there will also be like character notes in there and I'll be like, okay, so the character, this is all the stuff about this character, this is all the stuff about this character, and then here's kind of a chronological order of the events that I was thinking of. And it's been a really easy outlining process for me because I used to kind of do more of a intentionally structured approach where I would kind of make an outline and then each step I would go, what happens next? What happens next? What happens next? And it didn't flow as well. There wasn't as much of a kind of natural rhythm to it as when I took all these chaotic pieces and I just organized them. I just put them in order. And then usually you'll see where the gaps are. It's like, oh, well, how do we get from, you know, this thing happening to this thing happening? Okay. And then a lot of times I will just write in something happens to make them go here or, you know, something vague, and I can go back when I'm finalizing that outline and kind of figure out what that is. And other times I will come to that when I'm halfway through a story and I'll be like, oh, I never did figure this out. I should probably do that now. But at that point, I know the characters better, I know the plot better, and I usually have an answer. And so it's been kind of a really easy way to go from concept and these scattered ideas to then outline. And from there, it's pretty easy to just start writing and going into it. Or like, I guess I do characters too, but kind of get like some character profiles in there as well. And then kind of just naturally happens.
And are you getting sort of this download and writing in these notes when you're out in public, or it's just across the board, it's everywhere?
So it's a bit of everywhere. I mean, sometimes, you know, it'll just be, you know, I have a lot of falling asleep, you know, about to go to bed, and I'm like, oh, and I grab my phone and I like type ideas, and sometimes those ideas don't make sense in the morning, but sometimes I am out in public, or a lot of times I get ideas when I'm reading. You know, I'm reading something clever that someone else has been working on, and they have this kind of spark of concept, and I'm like, oh, you could use that. You could apply that to something else. You could do something else with it. Or like I said, I'll have these things that I expect, that I'm reading something and I expect it to go a certain way, or I think, ooh, are they going to do this? This could be interesting. And then they don't take it, and I go, well, if you're not going to use that, I'm going to use that, because that's kind of interesting to me. So like it does kind of happen all the time, and sometimes it'll be, you know, I'm in the grocery store and I'm like, oh, idea. But I think more so than anything, it happens when I'm reading or watching something. I'm kind of, you know, interacting with other people's art in some way, and I kind of get little chunks of inspiration from what they're doing and see how I can apply it to my own work.
And so then you use this sort of holder of like something happens to get them from here to there. And is that because you're having fun with certain other parts and you don't want to stop and have to think about how does this logically happen?
Yeah, I think it's a really different approach than when I first started writing, because I used to kind of think like I have to have the answers, everything has to make sense, everything has to, you know, be laid out in such a way that it all comes perfectly together. And I downloaded Wattpad And I was like, okay, because I was curious about After. I don't know how much you guys know about After. It's this fan fiction that was just wildly successful all around the world. It was about Harry Styles. It turned into a movie. And when the whole movie deal news came out and everything, I was like, what is this? I was like, this is fascinating to me. What, I didn't know what real person fan fiction was. I didn't know how someone writes fan fiction about Harry Styles and then it becomes a movie. It was all so curious to me. So I read it, and it was like nothing I've ever read before, because it was written by a totally novice author. And she was just having fun with it. She was just writing something she loved. And some of the plot points were just, there was no connection. It was just like, just happened. And I know there were a lot of authors who were like, oh, this is trash, this is garbage, this is no good sort of thing, because she doesn't do those things. And to me, I kind of thought, but how interesting is that as a storytelling technique, to do away with the rules of, I have to tell the story so well that there are no holes, I have to do this perfect thing. She wrote the parts she wanted to write and didn't write the parts she didn't want to write. And like, that kind of blew my mind in a way, because I have this, traditional education on how to write. And, I'm sure my professors would just be like sobbing if they were seeing this kind of stuff, like, oh, you can't write like that. And it's like, this piece of art reached, multiple millions of people. That's insane. And they did it by just breaking all the rules. And they were like, I want to write these parts and I'm not going to connect them. And it's kind of funny, because sometimes you'd be reading it and someone would just show up. And I'd be like, where'd this person come from? It's like, doesn't matter. It's not important. There's drama happening. You move on instantly because things are happening in your face and there's so much going on that you almost don't even care that it doesn't make sense. And I started trying to apply that to my own writing. I was just like, just write whatever. Just put it out there and you can clean it up later. And what ended up happening was that I would get to these points where I'd be like, oh, I haven't connected these at all. But by the time I got there, I knew enough about the story. I was familiar enough with what I was doing and my characters that I could connect it really quickly. And I could be like, you know what, I can fill in this gap really easily. It's not as hard as it seemed when I hadn't been working with these characters, when I hadn't been working in this universe. I didn't have all these answers, but by the time I get to it, I'm in the groove. I have more of an understanding of what it is that I'm writing. And it's not that I've gone so much in that direction of, oh, I just let things, stay unconnected. It's just that I can make those connections rather quickly, and it doesn't have to be, as large of a scene or as key to the story as I necessarily thought. I can find a way to stitch these together in a way that is, seamless and makes sense, but still has that kind of, impact of, going between interesting scene to interesting scene and not having a lot of downtime where you're just kind of like, come on, move along, I'm bored, sort of thing.
So almost the way TikTok or YouTube Shorts, maybe someone that came from traditional filmmaking would be like, well, this isn't filmmaking. Mm-hmm. Was it something similar to that with After?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you will still see lots of authors just like, oh, this is not literature. This is the downfall of writing as you know it, kind of thing. And I feel like anytime someone has created something and someone else finds value in it, that is valuable art. And for me, do I think that, a literature professor would see her work and be like, oh, it's fantastic? No, they wouldn't like it, and that's fine. It's not for them. It's for a specific audience. It's for a younger female audience who is interested in this particular person and these particular concepts, and it's connected with them. And, the fans who love this book, and it's a book series now, they love it. It is so deeply ingrained in who they are and their experience with reading. And to me, it's like, well, anything that is that impactful, anything that has that much effect on the people who are reading it or interacting with it, like there is value there. There is something to be learned there, even if it's not the traditional rules, even if what you learn is that you should break those rules.
And so has Harry Styles commented on?
I don't know. You know, I know I looked into it at some point, and I think he hadn't at that point. I'm sure he must have said something, but I know when they published this book, they did change the names, and it was very alternate universe, so it wasn't really even about him. I think it kind of used him more as a starting point for the writing, but it was fascinating, just all the rules they were breaking and the kind of things they were doing. You were seeing kind of the bare bones of why stories work, because it didn't have all the training and all the fluff. And I think, as far as I know, the author is just, a novice author, not classically trained, and just kind of went into it from a fan's mindset, from someone who loves, the topic in some way. And it was such a neat thing to kind of see how you get the story down to its bare bones. You don't need all of this extra stuff around it. And the readers don't mind. They don't mind. They want entertainment, and they want that pure love of the story, of the characters. And when the author has that, you can kind of let a lot of else slide.
And so that's exclusively on Wattpad right now?
It's also a physical book.
Oh,
I mean, it's in bookstores now. It's a big deal. Huh. I know one of the movies came out during the pandemic, and it was like #1 in like theaters. It was one of the only things getting people back into theaters. And there's this tremendous fan base for this book, and for a lot of books like it. And I think it's telling us that maybe what readers value is not necessarily the rules and the structure and all the things that they teach you in school. And you can use those tools to create a really powerful story. But if you don't have the foundation that clearly that author had, and a lot of authors have, of a really fascinating, compelling story, then, those tools aren't going to save you. Those tools aren't going to make a good story. But you can have a good story and not have the tools, and people will still come to it.
Yeah, it seems like anytime somebody is like this outlier and breaks the rules, like maybe sort of the old guards are like, no, this isn't right. And I'm sure the same thing happened to Tarantino. I'm sure it happened to David Foster Wallace. He's writing this 1,000-page book with things in the footnotes and all these different things. And it's like, well, no, that's not real fiction. So it's interesting to see older generations push against something if it works.
Yeah, and I've noticed too that the ones that always get the hardest time are the people who write for young women. It's, and it's not just writing, it's music, it's anyone creating stuff for young women. They're kind of seen as less than because, oh, well, young girls like that. So that's, trivial, that's not as important. And romance often falls into that category. The case of After was like a new adult book for like, college age young women. And it was like, oh, it's it's superficial because, it's the things young girls like, it's romance. And we tend to downplay those things, like the opinions of, girls and women aren't as valid, as important. Art that's made for them is, less valid and less important. And of course, it was written by a woman, a young woman, and it was like, oh, well, there you go. She's not a real author. She doesn't count. Like, I think society is more willing to quickly dismiss women and be like, oh, you don't count. The things you like don't count. And, anytime someone is writing in that field, they're going to get even more criticism.
Sure. And I think it's a threat too if people do vote with their dollars or their views. And it is someone that's like considered a quote unquote outlier, that can also ruffle feathers.
I've seen many people basically complaining about books like After, or anything on Wattpad that they don't see as quality. And they're saying, well, oh, people only want to read trash. People only want to read, vampires making out or whatever. And, people don't want to read good fiction. If they want to read good fiction, they'd be reading my stuff sort of thing. And there's this sense of entitlement, like my stuff is good, people should be reading my stuff, people should want my stuff, and the fact that they don't is a reflection upon their poor taste. It's a reflection upon, how they don't understand or appreciate good literature. And I feel like I always wonder why people aren't reflecting on those moments when you're seeing like, this thing is doing very well and people really love it and nobody loves the thing I'm working on. I think sometimes you need to ask the question of, why does nobody love the thing I'm working on? Is there an audience for it? Is there something that I can learn from this other thing that I don't understand? And translate that into me making a better story that more people can relate to and are interested in. And I think not enough people ask that question. They just get up in arms that they don't like it. It's unfamiliar. They're frustrated. They think my stuff is quality, your stuff is low quality, and people should like my stuff and not yours. And quality, especially in art, is just so subjective. And you can't really have that, that mindset when you're a writer of people should like my stuff. Well, if you're going to be that way, just write whatever the heck you want and tell them they should like it. Like, it doesn't really matter. But if you're going to be open to learning and open to growth, then you're going to find things in other people's work that's successful that help you grow and help tell you why your stuff isn't working as well.
What's the most important part of your writing process?
I think it's probably kind of the early work that I do to set everything up. I use Scrivener as a software. I know there are some other options, but for me, that's the one I find works best. And I will use their character profiles, their location profiles, and I will especially do a deep dive into those characters and flesh them out. And I have certain sections on each character profile that I've added, like the curse words that they'll use. And, some characters are cursing up a storm and other characters are saying darn or, whatever. And I have kind of a variety of, I even mark filler words, for example, like some characters will say whereas other characters will say or something like that. And just kind of like all these little details, what drinks they order, things like that. And I want to get to a point where I feel like I have an answer to any question someone could ask me about this character. And when I do that, it's kind of like, it's a pain in the beginning because it's a lot of work and it's a lot of, going through, I tend to pick like an actor or something that I visualize the character as, and I have photos of them and photos of kind of the style they'd wear, and I figure out, their ages and when they were born. And, but once I've done that work, the writing is very natural. It's very easy. I don't have to feel like I'm making up things as I go along, so I don't have to come up with details when I get to the part where they go to a bar and someone orders a drink. I know what their drink is. I have that note. I can go right back to it and I just fill it in. And it becomes less of, it kind of creates a, what's the word? An assembly line of sorts, kind of an assembly line process where I put a lot of that initial work in creating a character and figuring out what they're like up front, so that when I'm doing the writing, I'm doing writing and I'm doing plot, and I am not focused on character details. I'm not focused on kind of every time I have to stop and come up with a new thing and like, I have to come up with what they might wear. I can just I usually have 2 windows open and I've got one open and I'll see like, here's some pre-picked out outfits that I already decided that they will wear. And I just, immediately put that in, and it really streamlines my process because then I'm able to focus on one thing at a time. And it's just the writing. It's not in that second coming up with all these different traits and things that I need to know. If I need to figure out the layout of the bar or whatever, I've done that ahead of time, so I don't need to stop what I'm doing, completely interrupt the process, and then come back and try to pick up where I left off. I can just really quickly have that information on hand. And at least for me, having that kind of those different chunks of what I'm working on at a time, it's so much easier to focus and so much more natural. I've done books in the past where I didn't do that, And it's just you're constantly interrupting yourself. It's constantly like, oh, I have to stop. Oh, I have to do this other thing. Oh, I have to figure this out. Oh, I didn't do this yet. And it just really drags down my productivity, but it also, I think, messes with my ability to tell a really good story if I'm not focused solely on the storytelling in that moment.
So sort of similar to when you can read something and not know the characters' names, but by the dialogue you would know. If you know this person's drinking a shot of Jack Daniels and this person's having a lemon drop, I know that it's definitely these two people. Like, it's very clear who your characters are.
Yeah, and I've really worked at that, and I wasn't sure how much that was going to translate and how much the readers were going to see it, but I get constant comments all the time where, you know, before if I've had a character show up in a series and they come back, and I'll just describe someone, you know, at the bar or something, someone will go like, oh, I know them, you know, they're like, I know who that's gonna be, or, you know, I'll describe like, oh, they're walking down the street and they see this person, and I was like, oh my God, I know who that is. There's enough detail that I've given the readers that now they're right there with me. They know exactly what's coming. They recognize people from brief descriptions. Like one of my characters, I brought back in a series, and I just described him from a new character's perspective as kind of looking like a golden retriever, if a person were a golden retriever. And I've never used that description of that character before. And everyone in the comments went, oh, we know who that is, we love him. And they were instantly like with me because I had done enough of that background work that's all I had to say. I'd never used this phrase to describe this character before, but it was enough all around that they were able to immediately get the shorthand, immediately get what I was going for. And a lot of times, you know, they will say things like, oh, I know exactly what he would do in that situation, or like, oh, we all know what he's going to say now, kind of thing, because that background work is effective, and it is making them as familiar with the characters as I am.
And so you say Scrivener is what you use to sort of organize things. Do they do screenplays too, or is it just all?
Yeah, they do. They do a bit of everything. I know they have kind of, it's a very loose structure, and it gives you a lot of functionality for if you want to change things, if you want to make things specific to your process. It's very, very customizable, which I really like. But they have this system where you can export as any kind of file. So you can export it as a particular style of script. You can, you know, customize exactly how you want the script printed, sort of thing, or you can export as a book. You have all these options, and it'll do that formatting at the end, which I think is really nice.
So you're using the notes function or something like that on your phone, and then you take it and put it in Scrivener? And
I often I have those loose pieces on my phone, and then I will just when I have a moment and I'm working on it on my computer, I will go in and I will kind of copy over the relevant stuff, put it in a little more neat format so that I feel like I can actually look at it and know what I'm talking about and find it when I need to find it. And then it's in Scrivener, and they have like a notes section, and they'll have places for photos, for maps, whatever you need. And I really like that functionality because I use so many different things. Like, you know, I was talking about how I'll figure out like the layout of a place. I will do that. I will like draw a map and like figure out, you know, like here's where the door is, here's where things are for any kind of like big, you know, places that I'm going to be using frequently, or that I know there's going to be a big scene there and I want those details. And then I will just have that available in the sidebar, and just like click, it opens in a side window, and I can look at it and I can be like, okay, that would make sense, and work things out. And it's very like multimedia friendly, and just the customizability is really high. Like, I think there's a learning curve because of that, because there are so many options. But when you figure out what works for you, I really like all the options that they have and the functionality they offer.
And do you always do sort of this like vision board for your characters?
Generally, yeah. I think I started out that way because I just was like looking into like how do people tend to start, and like a lot of people have like character sheets and things like that. And so I was like, okay, I'll kind of start with something like that and figure it out. And I've found that like as I write, I kind of know the things that I'm going to need. You know, like the drink order is kind of a silly one, but it's something that comes up a lot because you'll have people at restaurants, you'll have people at bars, you know, especially in romance, you know, they'll be going out dancing or something like that. And like these little bits of information are so helpful. And I'm also a very visual thinker. So a lot of times if I can just see them, you know, if I can just like, oh, this is kind of the person I have in mind, I can kind of like look at the individual and be like, what do they like? What do they do? You know, it's kind of the like people watching in a sense, where, you know, I can look at this image of a person or several images of, you know, an actor or someone interesting that I found and be like, okay, yeah, what would they like? What would they think? And having that easy like back and forth between a lot of the visual stuff that I rely on and my, you know, my writing, and just being able to kind of do that simultaneously, it really works for my brain.
Is there almost a color palette for that person?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if everyone does that. I do that. I tend to kind of make a color palette for my people. Like, these are their favorite colors. These are what they like. And like, I have some characters that like, oh, they're really into every color, you know, but you know, at the same time, they're probably not going to show up in like gray or beige or something like that. But there are characters that I'm like, they have like 4 colors. That's what they wear. That's what they do, you know, because for whatever reason, they're a, you know, particular person, or, you know, they like to keep everything simple in their life, or whatever kind of reason I have at the time for thinking that they would be limited in that way.
Sure. There's been studies that they've said like super successful people, Steve Jobs being one of them, different people, have wearing the same outfit.
Yeah.
For the, you know, it's like their signature outfit. And so, yeah, that's...
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of, you know, especially the like straight male characters, I tend to give them more of a limited color palette, because I think a lot of straight men tend to think more in that fashion of like, you know, utility. I want things that go together. I have a blue thing, I'll get another blue thing, great. And, you know, whereas I have some of my more, you know, outlandish queer male characters, and it's like, oh, he's got like every color and every pattern, and, you know, he's wearing metallics, and his, you know, buttons are down to here, and, you know, he's like, I always kind of like imagine certain characters like, oh, they've probably got like a feather boa lying around somewhere, right, or something like really over the top. But like, I think that color palette can also kind of tell you something about them. And I think if you look in anyone's closet, there's a color palette there. You know, there are things that we lean towards. There, you know, like I know some people who like, they have one color and they wear one color and that's what they do. And then like me, I've got a bit of an explosion. It's a bit of everything, you know, but I've also got a lot of bright yellow. I'm sure anytime I see something bright yellow, I'm like, what is that? That's interesting. You know, bright pink. I'm like, ooh, you know, I'll immediately, you know, find it on the rack and check it out, sort of thing.
How important is it to write bad pages? Awful, embarrassing?
So important. I think that is something that I cannot emphasize enough. It is crucial to allow yourself to write bad stuff, because like somewhere along the line, I came across this like quote that was basically saying, you can't edit what you haven't written. And I just thought that was just perfect advice, because you can spend forever trying to rewrite the same sentence over and over again, making it right, making it perfect before moving on. And I don't think it helps your craft at all. I don't think redoing that sentence 8 times and finding the best reason, you know, the best perfect way to say that sentence really contributes to your skill. I think it is much more valuable to just write it, put it out there, put the words on paper or, you know, digitally. And once you have those words, then you can look at how to perfect it, how to make it better. But this idea of, you know, trying to make it perfect on the fly is really unrealistic. And it's something that you don't really see in other forms of art, but writers think they can just do it the first time. You know, we can just throw it out there. Like, you're never going to see a sculptor just like, you know, try to carve the whole thing at once and they're done. Look, looks beautiful. It's perfect. You know, like that would be a waste of time. You know, they do a rough version and then they go in for details and then they get smaller and smaller, finer details. And it's the same with most arts, but I think writers kind of have this feeling that it needs to be perfect. It, right out of your brain and onto the page, it needs to be flawless. And I think you don't take any risks when you do that. You don't push yourself, you don't say anything interesting or unique, and you don't give yourself time to reflect on your own work. Because if you're in, that single mindset when you're writing, that is just, one moment of your time. And if you come back and look at something a couple days later, you are going to have a different perspective on it. You're going to be able to see it more clearly. But if you're trying to do it all in that moment, you're just very limited in the scope of what it is that you can achieve and how good you can make it. And so I think I've talked to a lot of writers who, oh, someone told me this thing that I wrote was terrible and I feel really bad and I'm never writing again. And I'm like, if anything, that's just telling you that you're doing something worthwhile. You are, creating something bad and putting it out there. Like, that's honestly, it's easier in a way it's easier to put out, really good work than to put out bad work, if that makes sense. I think there's a lot more that goes into the risk and the bravery of putting out something that is imperfect, that has flaws, and allowing people to critique it, to give you feedback and that sort of thing, and even allowing yourself to take that time and give yourself feedback. And when you're just trying to make it perfect and put it out there, like, well, yeah, if you put out something perfect, great, good for you, but what did you learn? What have you benefited from in doing that? It's not hard to put out something perfect because you're like, yeah, it's great. I know it's great. I did it. It's a great thing. But I think you're really limiting yourself if you're trying to do that all the time. If everything you put out is supposed to be perfect and ideal, you're not going to make mistakes necessarily, but you're also not going to make something really interesting.
And so in 2019, when you sort of revisited writing, if I have this correctly, and you downloaded Wattpad, were you in that mindset that, even though I've been trained this way and you had time wanting to be a journalist, I'm going to allow myself to dip my toe in? Like, how did that work?
I think I actively tried to have that mentality when I got back into writing. It was like, you know what? I'm not doing this for anyone else right now. I am allowing myself to make mistakes. I'm allowing myself to break rules. I'm challenging that sense of, perfectionism, and kind of challenging my knee-jerk reaction to, hide it until it's perfect and make everything flawless. And one of the things with live posting your work, or at least semi-live posting my work, I usually have like quite a buffer built up, but I will post stuff that's, it's not perfectly edited, it's not finished. It's stressful, but it comes with so many gifts in, the ability to get that instantaneous feedback and to get people seeing your work and relating to it and interacting with it in a way that is not really common for authors to get to do. And when I started learning that, I realized, oh, I can allow myself these mistakes because, one, the audience understands. This particular audience, they know it's not a finished book. They know that's not what they're looking for. But also, it gave me the freedom in my writing process to, add the crazy scene that didn't really make sense, or, add something silly that I thought was just for fun, And a lot of those small risks, they seem big when you're making them, but I look back and I see them as small risks. They really paid off. A lot of the things that I thought like, maybe I won't include that, or, should I edit down, or should I, do this a different way? A lot of those things are the things that my readers will say, I love that thing. I'm so glad you kept that thing. I'm so glad you have this chapter or this character, or, this was the scene breaking moment for me, or whatever. Those things are usually those risks, the things I wouldn't have done otherwise, the things that I would have held back on. And when I kind of push myself out of my comfort zone and I'm like, you know what, just go for it. Just see what happens. This is a low risk situation. If it pays off, great. If it doesn't, oh well, I can change it later. And like it tends to pay off. I think there's a reason why your instincts, you know, are pushing you to try these things and to write badly and come up with ideas that like, oh, maybe that's cliche or maybe that doesn't work, because you have to test the waters. You have to, you know, attempt it to see what happens, because we're in an age where a lot of things have been done before, and there's a lot of art that's already been made. And if you have this feeling that, oh, I want to try this, I want to add something here that I think could be received badly, there's a reason you have that feeling. It's telling you something. It's urging you forward, and I think it almost always pays off.
And another thing I noticed about with Wattpad, and I'm sure that's with other you know, platforms as well, is that you have a list of trigger warnings, which I found fascinating. And that's a risk in itself, because, you know, if you can't talk about certain things, then you can't really explore them and heal them. But then I get it, some people could be either offended or it could send them in a spiral. So I just thought that's interesting. That's a risk itself.
Yeah, I mean, I really believe in trigger warnings, because I think there's just no reason not to include them, because the people who need them are going to care about them, and the people who don't need them, they don't really care. They're going to move right along. And I think people are afraid as writers, like, oh, well, I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to, you know, if I say my story contains, you know, violence or pregnancy or whatever it may be, like that in itself could be a spoiler sort of thing. But I think people don't necessarily mind small spoilers like that. I think there's more risk to not telling people enough about your story and having them go in blind and feeling, you know, offended or betrayed, or, you know, just like they didn't have a sense of what the story was and they misjudged it. Like, readers are not going to walk away happy if they go into a story thinking it's one thing and they come out with something entirely different. They're like, whoa, I didn't see this coming. I didn't want this. This wasn't, even if it's just, I'm not in the mood for this today. You know, I think as writers, we are so protective of our stories and, you know, the plot twists and the things that we think are going to be really important, that we don't give enough information. And I think the same holds true for story descriptions. I will see so many people be so vague in their story description that I'm like, I have no idea what this is about. You know, like, I've just read 3 paragraphs and I don't know what your story is about. Like, you're not going to get people in the door that way. You're way better off telling them way more than they need to know. And, you know, if someone gave you a brief synopsis of a movie and said, oh, it's about this, and this guy goes here and he does this and he does that, you're not going to go, oh, well, great, now I'm not going to see the movie. You know, it's like, oh, well, that's too much information. It's all over. I can't see it now. Like, most people use that information to make choices about what it is they're going to spend their time on. And in the case of triggers, there are people who have really severe psychological reactions to things. And I know that there are some people who, like, I don't believe in trigger warnings. I don't believe in acknowledging these things. You know, for whatever reason, they think it lessens the work. And I think, you know, if you want to be the most informed reader you possibly can be going into my book, I want to give you the resource to do that.
Have you ever begun a story thinking of the cover art?
Oh, I think sort of. You know, I was saying I'm a very visual person. I think that there's inevitably some thoughts there. There's kind of like, oh, you know, I kind of have this vague image of what I'm imagining for the cover. Sometimes it doesn't work. The cover that I had in mind, like one of my books is The Demon King of Lust, and I imagined him on this like big throne and like kind of leaning to the side and looking very wicked sort of thing, and I could not find the right art for it. It's just like, it wasn't working, and I went with like my 4th attempt at the design, and that was the one that I stuck with, and it was entirely different. It's like him kind of like holding a fireball and like kind of this glowing pentagram thing behind him. And it looked really cool, and it wasn't at all what I had in mind. But I think there's always kind of like a rough sense of like, oh, maybe this will be what it looks like. But I think that sense rarely translates to what it ends up being.
Now, do you, as a reader, choose a lot of things either on Wattpad or whatever place that you consume books by the cover?
I think somewhat. I think there's always going to be that initial interest when you're looking at cover and title, and it's going to be very quick. Like, what am I seeing here that strikes up this initial interest? And if you don't kind of get in the door with a good cover and title, then they are not going to be swayed by the description they're never going to read, you know. And in my case, I think I tend to gravitate towards covers with real people, which is like not the trend right now. A lot of the trend is more art and illustration, and I think that's fine. And if that's what you're into, that's great. I think a lot of times covers are a great shorthand for what's going on inside the book. And in my case, I tend to gravitate towards the real people covers because, one, they tend to be, you know, books for adults, and I tend to prefer the adult books rather than the YA or even just kind of the more like sweet, clean romance. You know, I tend to like the fiery, intense romance books and stuff like that. And they tend to lean more on the side of, you know, real photographs versus illustrations. But there is also a shorthand that you can see with genre. And with paranormal, which is a lot of what I read, you will see a lot of photos rather than illustrations. Illustrations tend to lean more on the side of contemporary romance and chick lit and those kind of like more general romantic fiction. And then there's kind of the other end of fantasy where you will get more realistic illustrations, like painted illustrations and stuff like that. And they're usually more elaborate and there's a lot more detail in them. And when I'm just browsing books, you kind of have that innate sense in your head of what you're looking at. Oh, I'm looking at fantasy right now. Oh, I'm looking at, you know, contemporary romance. And sometimes that's wrong. I've seen books where the cover made me think one thing and I take a look at it and it's something entirely different and unexpected. And I can imagine there's got to be some sort of reason why they do it that way. But I think for the most part, I try not to do that because I think if you're trying to attract the right reader, show them something that they think they want. You know, and if they're going, oh, I love fantasy books and I'm looking for a fantasy book, if your cover is not, you know, somewhat similar to the standard, you're going to be throwing off that reader. And maybe they're going to put a lot more, you know, emphasis on what that cover is in what they assume your story is about. And you want to attract the reader that wants your story, not the reader who wants, you know, the story that has this cover necessarily. You know, if it's mismatched, there's going to be disappointment either way. And so I think there's kind of this fine line between, you know, adhering to those tropes and standards and trying to fit in, but also, you know, you don't want the book to look like every other book on the shelf. So there's this balance, but at least for me, I try to at least have that kind of quick judge cover that says on the outside something that I think will be well represented by what's on the inside of the book.
Yeah, interesting, because just perusing TikTok last night in preparation for today, just seeing the different books people were recommending holding up, and it did seem like some of them that were more maybe conventional or sweeter or something, it was more hand-drawn illustration, beautifully done, and maybe ones that were a little more intense, it was like a picture and more sort of fantastical. You know?
Yeah, I think that it's just kind of human nature to see these images and make quick assumptions, because especially when you're looking for books right now, there's so many offerings. You know, you go on Kindle, you can be just scrolling for days. There's just so many options, and you can't possibly look at every single one and open it up and read the description, whether you're in person or you're, you know, on your phone or wherever. It's just not feasible to do. So we have to have some kind of shortcut, and I think that visual is the first shortcut that a lot of people rely on.
How do you structure a novel?
for me, I don't pay a lot of mind to classic structure rules. I think, if you're going for a very traditional, kind of classic fiction book, maybe that would apply more. Maybe you're trying to go for the hero's journey or something like that. But I feel like people are already inclined to kind of follow some structure naturally, and you will find that it either is making sense to you or it's not making sense to you. And so I try to be a little more organic about how I approach structure, and I will kind of do a brief overview of like roughly when should this happen. Like I want to give myself time to, close out kind of after the big climax sort of thing. So you're obviously not going to have that at the end, but if you have that in the middle, you're going to have, a lot of space where you don't know what to do with that space. So I try to be kind of free form and then occasionally take a look at the big picture and make sure that the big picture is still making sense. It still feels like the pacing is right, and it's not feeling like, oh, why did this suddenly end up, a third of the way into the book when it should be somewhere in the middle. And usually I think those things come naturally to me. And it's also because I write a lot of serial fiction, which means that people are reading, frequently updated things, and they're reading once a week and things like that. I don't think I have to conform to those rules as much, because there's a sense of it being more like a television show structure, or something that has more breathing room, something that goes on for longer, so you can kind of have these longer arcs that don't have the clear set points along the way, and readers are more open to that when it's in that serial structure.
And then when you stumbled upon after on Wattpad, did that give you freedom to be like, if this person is not really writing within a certain structure, and maybe they were, I don't know, but it seems like they weren't. It was different. That and this works, and I'm enjoying this, and other people obviously are too. That I don't have to be bound by that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I've learned so much from reading novice authors, be it on Wattpad, Inkit is another site, but any of these places where you're engaging with people who are not strictly in this field, trained in this field, you are going to find these interesting things that they're doing, and you're going to see exactly what it looks like when you break the rules. And sometimes you break the rules and it doesn't work, and you go, oh, that's why we have the rule, now I know. But a lot of times you go, oh, you know what? Maybe that wasn't all that necessary. Or maybe there's a way to do this where I can, find the loophole, find a way around this rule that I don't necessarily like or that I feel constrained by. And I think that's kind of been the key for me, is anytime I felt constrained by something, anytime I felt like, oh, I wish I could do this, or if only I didn't have to do it this certain way, I have to kind of push back. And that's where I think these novice authors, they don't know that they're pushing back, and they are. And I learned from them that when you do push back on those, a lot of times you create better work. So in the case of, structure, do I have to follow the hero's journey? Do I have to, have the curves and try to figure that all out? I didn't like doing that. I didn't enjoy it. It felt forced. It felt like I was trying to, fit a square peg into a round hole. And that's the perfect opportunity to go, wait, do I need to do this? Why am I doing this? Is it actually helping me, or is it hindering me? And nowadays, when I see those things that I kind of naturally feel like, oh, I don't love doing this, this isn't the part that makes me happy, I immediately ask myself, do I need to do this? Have I seen it done successfully without this? And a lot of times the answer is yes. And I think, readers, they don't care much about if you're following the rules. They care about the experience. They care about what's enjoyable to them. And if you're hitting those notes, then it doesn't really matter so much if you're following the rules or breaking them, as long as you are kind of writing in a way that feels natural and honest to you.
What structure do you use to write, especially when you have some books that have over 50 chapters?
I tend to have initially I have a vague outline, but it is vague, and I have a habit of adding in more chapters along the way because my husband often will ask me, oh, how many chapters do you have left in your book? And I'll say 10. And then he'll ask me 3 chapters later and I'll say 10. And I think what's nice about the serial format is it does kind of give you the permission to put more stuff out there than you otherwise would in an edited book. You have to keep to a certain page count. You have to be concerned with printing and things like that. And for me, I've found that I kind of see it as episodes of television or anything else where there should be, a minor arc and then this major arc throughout the whole thing. But any individual chapter has something happening, something going on, that is the specific plot of that chapter or episode equivalent. And I tend to end on what I didn't think were cliffhangers, but my readers have told me are cliffhangers. But basically, I tend to end on kind of a quick preview into the next scene, something that tells you what's about to come. So, whether it's someone gets a phone call and that phone call tells them, oh, we have big news, I will end that chapter there, and then the next chapter will be dealing with that big news. And so there is kind of that similar, episodic structure of the small plot, and then it's this big arc overall that you're doing while you're simultaneously like, oh, in this one, they're going ice skating and, learning how to skate or something like that, and it's this kind of little brief moment in time, and the readers really like those kind of, slice of life moments. But then there's always something I try to make sure in every chapter that is pushing the arc forward, pushing that big overarching plot into the next stage, whatever that may be, as well as having these little slice of my life moments and addressing the smaller, the smaller conflicts of the individual chapter.
And so with Wattpad, forgive me, I'm not totally certain how this works. You can put stuff in sort of like draft form, looking for feedback?
So you can put in draft form, but people can't read your drafts. They're not live. But so what I tend to do is I get it to a place where I'm reasonably satisfied with it, and I'm enough chapters ahead that I feel confident that I'm not going to need to go back and make edits that will affect the future. And then I go ahead and post those, and everyone knows if it's live posting, it is unedited. And I usually have like a little thing at the beginning. I'll say, this is live posting every week. I will post at a certain time, and it's not edited yet. Tell me if you see something. I'm a big proponent of, correct me, please. If you see an error, I want to know about it. And my readers are really great. They will happily tell me if I've missed punctuation or, if I've translated something wrong. Like it's kind of incredible to have this many eyes on your work and have them providing immediate feedback. But it's also like they're very forgiving because they know it's live, because they know, like, even though it's, like I said, not necessarily happening like I'm writing it and then I'm immediately posting it, they know that it's a work in progress. They know that there's still work to be done on it. And some readers, they wait until it's done. They want to see the finished product, they want to read it all at once, and they want to have that, complete form. And some readers, they're like, I don't care if it's imperfect, I want to read it right now. And they have that option too. They can, jump in 5 seconds after it's posted and start reading.
What's your process for writing scenes?
I think I'm pretty linear when it comes to individual scenes. I will sometimes write a scene out of order if I have a particular, spark of inspiration. I'm like, oh, I want this particular dialogue. But a lot of my writing is very dialogue focused. So it tends to be like, I tend to get right into the dialogue. And every once in a while I will find like, oh, I have this one bit that I just want to write of this scene right now because I've got something I want to say. And then I will have to kind of go through and throw those in when I remember oh yeah, I already wrote this part. I'll go back and find it in my phone notes and throw it in. But most of the time I do tend to be pretty linear and, you know, kind of following the scene start to finish.
What's the goal for every scene that you write?
I think I'm always trying to get emotion across in scenes. I think one of the things that I find so appealing about romance as a genre is that we get into, you know, the hearts and minds of the characters. We get, you know, into really big, thought-provoking emotions and how we relate to other people and how we let other people in or fight letting other people in. Like, I really find that appealing. I really find that, you know, this kind of great part of being a human, and how literature can kind of bring us into the minds of other people and bring us into their shoes and what they're thinking and feeling. And so for scenes, I focus a lot on, I want every scene to tell us something about the emotional landscape happening within that person, or maybe within, you know, multiple people. And I want kind of that impact to be front and center. And so if I have a scene where it's like, oh, there's just, you know, a lot of logistical things that they have to do, like, I try to strip that down and get rid of as much of the irrelevant to emotion parts as possible and go like, okay, if we're doing logistical stuff, what can I do to make this logistical stuff, you know, tell us more about the characters, tell us more about what they're feeling and thinking, show us how their dynamic is growing and changing. And I think, like, yes, obviously you want to make good plot, you want to make good stories, you want to have people interested in ultimately what's happening and, you know, conflicts and what's being solved. But I think if you're not having these characters grow and you're not getting to know these characters along the way, so much of that power of that story is lost. So I think my main focus for, if it's gonna be a scene that I'm gonna include, I want it to have that emotional weight. I want it to have, you know, some kind of level of interest, even if it's, you know, like I was talking about the small moment, if they're ice skating together, like, how do I show that, you know, like, oh, this character is afraid to be vulnerable, afraid to be bad at something. And okay, they're ice skating for the first time, and how do they feel about that? And, you know, how can, you know, the person they're falling in love with help them and give them space to, you know, be vulnerable. And like, I try not to do that in really dramatic, heavy ways. I like doing it in fun and funny ways, and like, you know, just giving you little peeks into who they are and what they're struggling with and how that kind of relates to their dynamic as individuals.
And so you'd said previously that you use sort of like a note to yourself if you can't totally figure out how they got from A to B.
Yeah.
And so is that part of where that would come in handy, because you really want to get the emotion of the scene down?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when you get to a point where you're like, oh, I don't have anything here, I have a note here and I haven't quite figured this part out, a lot of times at that point, I'll have started the character's emotional journey, I'll see where they are, and I'll be like, oh, you know, it would make a lot of sense. Maybe, you know, maybe they decide to go visit them because of this, or, you know, whatever I need to do to connect these dots. It's usually, you know, you can go back to that thought of how do I show who they are, and how do I emphasize the, you know, emotion that's going on here, rather than, you know, how do I do the logistics of they physically get in the car and they drive to the place, and like, that's not going to tell you much. But if you can find a way, like, oh, their motivation to go there is interesting, or, you know, the, you know, way they're feeling having to go there is interesting, or whatever the case may be, finding an emotional take on it, I think, can be really valuable.
If you get stuck on a scene, do you take a break, write another scene?
I tend to, so I certainly step away. But I've always felt like those sticking points are lessons that, like, if I am getting stuck, something is not working and I need to change my plan. I need to, you know, either cut the scene or adjust what I'm doing. If I'm if I'm running up against something again and again, and I wrote it and then I rewrote it and I still don't love it and it's still not working, I usually take a couple days and I'm like, okay, I'm thinking about it, and I'll be kind of just thinking about it in the back of my mind for a long time. And I'm usually trying to come up with ways that I can totally change it. It's like, okay, this is not working. What if I didn't have this scene? What would I have to do instead? What could I replace it with entirely? And sometimes just asking that question, I won't actually have to replace it entirely, but I will kind of come to a better understanding of like, oh, I can replace this part. This is the part I don't need. This is the part that I'm struggling with. Or if it's, any kind of thing that I'm bored with, or I'm, really not happy with the way it's turning out and I don't want to write it because I don't want to read it, I tend to be like, okay, maybe I can replace the whole thing. Maybe there's a whole new thing I can do with it. What do I really need? And I will look at the next scene and what I need to have happen by the next scene. And then I will ask myself, is there a situation where these things could happen that is not the one I have currently written? Maybe they don't go to this place at all. Maybe this is a phone call. Maybe this is an email, maybe this can be simplified in some way and I'll skip the chapter entirely, or maybe I can take it in an entirely different direction that I hadn't planned. Instead of making this, a date, I'll make it a conversation with their friend or something, and I will get the same information across, but in a totally different way. Because I think, at least for me, I have never found a lot of good comes from pushing up against a dead end. And when I am stuck, when I am in those spots where I'm like, this isn't working, I feel like I don't have the right thing to put here, it's just nothing I'm coming up with is working, that to me is always like, okay, I'm at a dead end, and forcing it is not going to get me anywhere. So I need to just kind of do a 180, redo this, and figure out what I can work with in this situation. And oftentimes I'll come back to it a couple days later and it'll just flow, and I'll be like, I've got the plan. I'm going to do it entirely differently. And then it's easy. And whenever it's easy, it's like, now it's working. Like if I'm not having trouble writing it, then it's flowing correctly. And there's not going to be a sticking point for the reader.
So it's almost as if that's a red flag. Like if you're stuck, it's not like really dig in and work it out. It's the universe saying this is not the way to go with the story.
Yeah, that's certainly always been my take. I think I would, like, when I first started trying to write fiction, many, many years ago, I kept just stalling out and giving up because I would hit walls and I didn't know what to do with them, and I would just write through them and I would keep going. And it's kind of like if you are going down the freeway and you realize you missed an exit and you're like, I'll just keep going. It's like, if I just keep going long enough, it'll be fine and it'll suddenly correct itself. And it's like, no, you're just going to be further away from where you want to be. You missed your exit. You got to turn around. And for me, that is exactly, like you said, a red flag. It is this moment of like, if it's not working for me, there's a reason it's not flowing. It's because I'm tripping over something. Something is, sticking here, and it's making it so that it doesn't flow. It doesn't feel natural. And my feeling of this isn't working is real. And it's my brain telling me this is not the direction you want to be going down. You need to change gears.
Why is the romance genre so popular?
I think romance is just something everyone can relate to. Even if you're not in a relationship, even if you're a romantic and never want to be in a relationship, I think romance is one of the only genres that's specifically about human connection. It's about how people relate to each other. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of women are interested in it. Women tend to, rely on community and rely on social interaction as a huge part of their lives. And I think there is a huge appeal to it. And one of the reasons it kind of became a female-dominated industry is because, it was the only thing women were allowed to write at one point, was about relationships in the home. But there there is this kind of, universal interest in love and how we interact with each other and how other people think and feel. And, for me, I always think about what other people are feeling, what other people are thinking, what I'm not hearing from their side of a conversation or, from their side of an interaction. And I think it's really nice to have this kind of window into these characters and these other people's lives, and you can feel that connection and you can have that kind of, vicarious sense of, love and happiness, but it's inherently interesting. We as humans, we love human stories, we love gossip, we love, human interest pieces because we want to know more about the people around us. And anytime we have a chance to get into someone else's mind or get in deep into their story, we want to do that. I mean, there's a reason why love songs are so popular. If you think of like 10 songs, I would bet 8 of them are love songs in some way, love or breakup song, and I think it's just very natural to want to explore that and to want to explore how other people think and feel. And with romance, there's also this great specificity to the genre in that the rules. There are very clear rules. If you talk to any romance reader, they will tell you it has to have a happy ending. It has to be about a relationship. 2 people have to fall in love, and there has to be that happy ending at the end. And there are, rare exceptions of people who will say, well, it doesn't have to be happy. The romance community will get their pitchforks. They will not be pleased with you for saying that. But it feels safe. It is, I can't tell you how many, times I open the news and I go, oh no. It's this instant feeling of like dread. You don't know what you're going to expect. It could be bad. Romance, you know what you're going to expect. It is going to be good. It is going to be pleasing. I think it's the same reason that people really like procedural TV shows. It's this feeling that I know it's going to be solved by the end, that I'm going to feel good, that, this is going to be uplifting in some way, that even if there's trauma, even if there's problems, that those problems will eventually be overcome, that people in this story are going to be loved unconditionally for who they are. And like, these are core things that I think everyone wants in their life. They want that safety, they want to feel that unconditional love, and they want to believe that any obstacle can be overcome and that someone will still love you on the other end and you will still be valued for who you are, and that mistakes are forgivable. And in romance, it's always true. There are so many different paths to get from A to B, but you will always start at A and you will always end up at B. And I think there's a great deal of comfort in that.
What book inspired you to write romance?
Oh, gosh, it's actually a really, a really funny answer, probably. There's a specific Wattpad book. It's a fan fiction. It's also a Harry Styles fan fiction, which is really funny because I don't know very much about Harry Styles. But it's called Stall, and it's a dark romance, and it's very bizarre and incredibly well written. And it's, without giving too much away, he's a very dark, scary person, and this woman falls in love with this very dark, scary man, and there's a lot of drama and like thriller elements. And I really fell in love with how deep the author went into human emotion and how she had this kind of normal person character fall in love with this very dark, disturbed individual. And I don't necessarily write that kind of dark stuff, but I was really fascinated with just how well crafted this piece of fan fiction was, and how deep they got into stuff that was, unpleasant and complicated about human emotion and love and things that I don't think anyone really tackles the way that particular piece of fiction tackles it. It was just kind of mind-blowing, and I went, well, I want to do this. Like, this looks really fun. Like I don't necessarily, have the chops for that kind of dark, dramatic work, but it was something that I saw a lot in it that I loved, that they had done really well, and that I saw as very like freeing. And I thought, if this random fan fiction author online can do something really spectacular with no limits and no rules, and create in this genre of real person fan fiction about Harry Styles that I didn't know existed, and I fell deeply in love with the book and deeply in love with the writer and the way she wrote, and it was just like, oh well, I want to do this. It's kind of like when you see someone do some sort of amazing trick or something, you go, I want to try. I want to do that. That looks like fun. And I felt so compelled to just see what my version of that would look like.
What were your notions of what romance books were maybe previously? Like you see them in the supermarket and it's always this amazing looking couple, but you're thinking, oh, well, I don't know if I really want to see what's inside. Or maybe you do.
Yeah, it's funny. I very much had the kind of stereotypical sense of what romance was before I started reading it myself. It was kind of like, I think I was specifically thinking about historical romance, first of all, which is funny because I had never read either. But I think you imagine the Fabio and the low-cut peasant shirt that he's got on, and this big dress she's wearing or something like that, and the classic bodice ripper cover, and I just assumed it was like about princesses or something. Like I was like, oh, it's like a princess thing, and and she falls in love with some sort of handsome rogue or something, but I didn't necessarily know what it was really, other than I think there's some kind of general message of like, oh, sex, there's some sort of sexuality happening here, and I think the instinct is like, oh, is it like just erotic stuff? Is that what they're writing about? Is that what romance is? And but I would also love romance movies, and I watched a lot of romantic comedies, and I thought those were really fun. And somewhere along the line, I realized like, oh, it's just that in book form. Like it's the same genre. It's just in books, and it's just because of our weird notions of romance and what qualifies as good literature or bad literature that, if it's popular, inevitably it's less good. And, when we see things that are dramatic like Fabio and having this hair blowing in the wind, like that's what's going to stick with you, is that image. And the reality of the genre is it's so wide, it's just incredibly ranging. I find myself constantly surprised, like there will be a new section of romance that I didn't know existed. I mean, I only recently learned about alien romance. It's a whole thing, and it's like just the door, that door was not open, and I opened it, I was like, oh my god, there's so much more back there. But like there's romance is its own genre, but it also has so many genres within it, and there's kind of every take, but it all comes back to, if it's alien romance, yes, it's a sci-fi story, but it's a sci-fi story where they focus on the relationship between two people. And same with fantasy. If it's fantasy romance, it's a fantasy story where the focus is on the relationship between two people. And it's so broad beyond that. Beyond there's a relationship, they fall in love, and it ends happily. Beyond that, there's so many directions it can go. And like, you could be talking about Snow White, you could be talking about 50 Shades of Grey. And like that range is so tremendous. And it's just so much more than what I expected. And I have a feeling in 10 years, I would be like, oh, it's so much more than what I knew back then.
So do you think that it's evolved so much from that stereotypical sort of supermarket novel that we would see maybe while we're in the checkout line?
I would suspect that stereotypical supermarket novel wasn't as bad as I would have assumed it would have been. I think there's maybe not so much growth in the genre as much as there is growth in our understanding of what it is. Because, I've seen some crazy covers now that I never would have picked up in a million years. I will pick them up now, and sometimes I will read like things that never in a million years did I expect I would like, whatever this strange concept is. And I'll start reading it and I'll be like, I like this. This makes no sense. Like, why do I like this? And I'm also just like one of those readers who like, I'm so interested in what other people are writing and what other people are creating with their stories that there's very little that I won't read. So I will sometimes pick up like, the other day I basically read a story about like an alligator man. An alligator man and this human woman falling in love. And I was like, I did not even know that's what that was when I picked that up. But I was so fascinated by their interesting takes on the genre and some of the things that they were doing with it. And it's like if you had told me, oh, here's a book about an alligator man falling in love with a woman, I'd be like, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. What, like that seems so silly. And then having read it, it was good. It was well crafted. The author did a great job. I often highlight things when I'm reading that are just like great little uses of words, and that whole book is covered in highlights. They did a great job, and I was just like, what do I know? I think there's that initial judgment, and I think as a society, we're learning more not to judge, so immediately, but as a person, I'm also learning not to judge so immediately. And, I'm guessing that the bodice ripper covers that I would have gone, oh no, there's no way I'm reading that. They probably were good. They were probably good, and I just didn't know.
You just triggered, I just remember the movie Mask, and I love that movie so much.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Oh yeah, with Laura Dern and Eric Stoltz, and then Cher's the mom, and yeah, it's so good. I don't want to ruin it. It's highly recommended, and I'm not always of like a romantic story, but this one is more about she's blind, and I don't want to give it away. You got to watch the trailer, and I think you'd like it. It's really sweet film. Has anyone tried to discourage you from writing romance novels?
I think certainly not the people in my life, but anytime I talk to other writers who write anything else, it's the second you say you write romance, it's like, oh. And especially for male writers, they're just like, oh, well, you're not a writer then. That doesn't count, kind of thing. And they won't necessarily say that in so many words, but you will also hear them talking before they know that you're a romance writer. They'll just be like, oh God, romance, that's such a, garbage genre, and like anyone can write that, and it's something that just like, I think makes me kind of laugh more than anything. I think there are people who would inevitably be discouraged by that, but I'm kind of at the point in my writing career where, I've seen so many people put down so many things, and it's just, I don't believe in that anymore. I believe in celebrating everybody's art. I believe, if you have something creative and interesting to put into the world, you put it out there and somebody will appreciate it and enjoy it. And I'm not gonna yuck anyone's yum, and if they're having a good time, that's excellent. And I think, I see it more as a general kind of industry feeling towards romance and the way that people will talk about it. That like, they might not say to you directly, like, oh, you shouldn't write romance. They'll just say like, oh, well, they're a romance writer. Like if I just wanted to make money, I could just get into romance. Like it's easy. Like it's just something everyone can do, sort of thing. Or it's the cheap fiction sort of thing. And I would love to see those people try. It's not straightforward, and I think it's considered straightforward because women write it and women read it. I think there's this kind of assumption that it's, it is supermarket fiction. It's, because it's accessible and because it's, popular, it's junk, it's, like junk food sort of thing. And I think the reality is that there are a lot of people out there just like me who hadn't picked up a romance book and who have no idea what it's about, and they're making a lot of assumptions. And they're less likely to say it to your face and more likely to just generally rant about romance as a genre and the romance novel industry than tell you like, oh, you don't want to get into this sort of thing.
What are the tropes a romance novel needs to have?
I feel like there's no trope that a romance novel necessarily needs to have, other than, like I said, happy ending, which is not necessarily a trope, it's more of just like one of the defining traits of the genre. But I do think that tropes are not necessarily essential, but very valuable in romance, because I think what a lot of people enjoy about romance is that it feels easy to read, to get into, to get invested in, and it doesn't require a lot of huge intellectual investment to understand and to be a part of a story and to relate to the characters. And tropes are just a really great shorthand for communicating ideas and getting people on board a little bit faster, a little bit easier with what it is you're trying to say. So I think there's no individual trope that it would like, oh, that's really important or you need to have that. But I think using tropes well is something that's really powerful, especially in romance, because it allows the reader to connect quickly and really efficiently. And you find that you can communicate so much with very little by using these little, bite-sized bits of information that we all recognize and understand. And when we have these patterns that we have in romantic tropes, I think it's both comforting and it allows you to immediately invest yourself in the story, to be familiar with the language, to be familiar with the situation. And, if I say enemies to lovers, everybody knows what that means. Everybody can immediately go, oh, this is an enemies to lovers story. I know a ton about that already. I know how that works. You're thinking, well, some people argue that Romeo and Juliet is not enemies to lovers, that it's actually star-crossed lovers, or what's the word I'm looking for? Their families are actually the enemies, sort of thing. But it gives you that sense of, oh, these people don't relate to each other at first. They learn to love each other over time. They grow emotionally attached, and then this passion that once was negative becomes positive. And you can say that in a very short amount of time. And when someone recognizes that trope in a book and sees like, oh, I see where this is going, they're on board. They're immediately that much further in than they would have been, and you can bring them in quicker and not spend a ton of time on details, especially in the modern era where I know very few people who would say, oh yeah, I have loads of time to read. I'm reading all the time. There are exceptions, and I read quite a bit myself, but time is precious. And if we can suddenly feel like we know the story, we know the characters, and we're getting invested much quicker and more easily, then it's just going to be that much more of a pleasant reading experience. And so a romance has a lot of these tropes, and I think when used effectively, they can be really great and really convenient for both the reader and the writer.
Well, what are some of those tropes, aside from enemies to lovers? What are some of those tropes?
So friends to lovers is another classic one where, there's also a concept called mutual pining, which tends to go hand in hand with friends to lovers, which is basically they're both in love with the other, but they don't think the other one is in love with them. And there's kind of that it happens a lot with friends to lovers, because oh, I really love them, but they just see me as a friend, and the other one thinks the same, and how do they come together, sort of thing. There's a concept about only one bed, which is, they both end up in a cabin and they're snowed in and there's only one bed in the room and they have to share, and, inevitably they end up cuddling for warmth or something, or more, but there's so many. I mean, there's a lot of books on brother's best friend, the kind of the kind of forbidden romance is a trope in itself, but there are several like specific forbidden romance, like brother's best friend, or some people do step siblings, and that's a more outrageous trope, but it's the forbidden thing, or like affair with a boss, some of these things where there's kind of some level of structure around it that we understand, and you go like, oh, okay, I see the setup, I see what's going on here. And you don't necessarily, have to be introduced to the concept because it's familiar. You've seen something like this before, you've heard of the concept before. There's, like in fan fiction, there's the concept of hurt comfort, where, one person is injured, or in some way insulted, or they're sick, or something happens to them, and the other character is their caretaker, and they're taking care of them and helping them, sort of thing. And there are some that are like specific to fan fiction, like there's the whole werewolves Omegaverse stuff that it has sort of become mainstream fiction, but started off as fan fiction mostly in the queer community. And they have kind of their own sets of rules for how werewolves work. And there's alpha wolves and beta wolves, and the alpha wolves mate with omegas. And like, there's a whole system kind of built in. And some of them are really structured like that. And some of them are just more, broad, like enemies to lovers.
Are there any alternative endings that are just sort of unacceptable in the romance community, or there's no hard and fast rule?
Unacceptable would be they break up. Like, firmly unacceptable. No one likes that one. I think the only people who argue with that really are authors who want to write that. But the readers pretty much all agree they can't break up. That can't be the ending. That can't be where it ends. There's a concept of both happily ever after and happy for now, and both are acceptable. Happily ever after is obviously they get married, they have babies, right off into the sunset, everything's good. Happy for now just means they're together, things are going well, there's no dark cloud over the horizon, end of book, right? And both of those are acceptable. I would say one that is really divisive and alienates a lot of readers is anything involving cheating. They're a little more forgiving if it's like, oh, the main character is cheating on a really terrible partner. The partner is just awful and they're cheating with this other man and they fall in love, or other woman and they fall in love. They're a little more accepting of that, but cheating is tough. I think a lot of people in the genre of romance specifically, they don't tolerate that. Readers do not want the negativity, the reality that comes with cheating storylines and how that makes them feel. And a lot of books will specifically say somewhere in their descriptions, like, no cheating, or sometimes they'll say safe, or happy ending guaranteed, or things like that, to reassure people that this will not be that kind of book. You do not have to worry about that. But technically, there are romance books that involve cheating storylines. It's just they do tend to alienate a lot of readers, and some readers are very against them entirely.
And is that because you go along on the ride and you become invested?
I think so. I think I think cheating can kind of break the illusion in a way. There is this level of fantasy, level of like, this is, we're talking about their bond and it's special. And I think a lot of people like to think that, there's such a thing as the one and soulmates, and that only these two people are perfect for each other and connected. And even if that's not the case, I think cheating has the potential to break them out of that, positive, fuzzy feeling, because it's more real. This is the kind of thing that happens in real life that can, really ruin a relationship and can cause really hurt feelings. And a lot of people have personal experiences with cheating, and it immediately brings them to that. It's kind of the same reason that we don't see, books where people are doing their taxes. Like, you're not going to see these life details that people don't enjoy. we don't want to, read a book and then this person get really sick and they spend 20 pages dealing with the insurance company. That's not something that is going to appeal to us, because books are escapism. And there are certain things that will pull you back into the real world. And most people don't want to spend their free time reading pulled back into the real world. They don't want to be thinking about, consequences and things going wrong and, divorce and cheating and these other realities that, we do have to deal with, but we wouldn't choose to deal with. It's something that is, a consequence of living in the real world and not necessarily something that we would ever seek out. So those things, anytime you're addressing something dark or overly realistic, it's a really fine line that you have to carefully walk, because you can bring the reader down in such a way that they don't want to keep going. That they're like, hey, I came here for fun, I came here for fantasy, I came here for a good time. I did not come here for reminding me of these horrible things that exist in the real world. And I think they're completely fine if you're like, oh yeah, this dark wizard is after you and they're gonna, throw a fireball at you. Great, fine, love that. And it's like, oh, this, evil internet troll is after you. Well, I don't want that. There's this fine line where they will absolutely tolerate drama and tension and conflict, and that is fine. But the more real it becomes, the more, uncanny and uncomfortable it becomes, and the more they're turned off of the story.
What's the difference between releasing a book on Wattpad versus Amazon? Yeah,
so I think one of the key differences is that generally on Wattpad you're releasing episodically. So you're, a lot of people call it serial fiction, where you're releasing, in a series that's often one chapter at a time or a couple chapters at a time. And you're kind of building an audience in the same way that you would a TV show or a podcast, basically where they are coming back for more, week after week sort of thing. And there's a little more flexibility, generally on Wattpad, unless you are specifically part of their paid programs, it's free. And so it's, they don't pay to read and you don't pay to post. It's just like a social media sort of thing. Wattpad does have their creators program and their paid program. I think it's now Wattpad Originals is what they're calling it now, where there is, you do get paid for, your reads and your work, but there's more of a readership that's not necessarily paying, or if they are paying, they're not necessarily paying as much as they would be on something like Amazon. So they're both a little more forgiving of if you have mistakes, if it's imperfect sort of thing, and also a little less discerning. They will abandon your book happily. They're like, well, I didn't really pay for this, so if I'm 2 chapters in and I don't like it, I'm gone. And that's if they make it 2 chapters in sort of thing. So there's a lot of, very quick decision making that's happening with the readers. And then, Amazon, on the other hand, you post the full book and you can kind of decide how much you're earning unless you're using a third party, like a publisher or something like that. But you have more say over what it is you're making and what those rates are. But it's also a very specific audience of people who are, either willing to pay for your content, or they are more avid readers who are part of Kindle Unlimited or something like that, where they're not necessarily paying for your content specifically, but they are paying for access to content like yours. And if they access your content, you will get paid for that.
Why did you pick Wattpad?
I think initially I wasn't really looking to make this more of a career. It was kind of like a hobby, and it was something that I wanted to try and put out there. And I saw that a lot of people were putting stuff out there on this platform and doing interesting work. And I was like, oh, I want to be a part of this community. I want to, you know, be able to engage with people. But I was kind of like, nobody's going to read it. Like, nobody's going to read my stuff, right? Like, that would be crazy. And I thought, like, oh, if I get anyone to read it, it'll be kind of fun. And then, you know, hey, I'll have a written book when I'm done, and maybe I'll try to publish it, or maybe I'll try to do something else. It was very low key, very just kind of see where it goes sort of thing. And I was very lucky that my first book blew up, and my subsequent books have done very well. And I think my first book has 2.5 million reads now, wow, which is just like,
it's awesome,
wild to me, because I was thinking like, oh, you know, if one person reads my book, that would be really cool. But I started realizing that, you know, Wattpad, they have a lot of opportunities. They have a lot of connections. They have a studio arm. They have their own publishing arm. They have a lot of ways for authors to make money, to connect with, you know, people in their field, and to kind of advance their careers in various ways. And they reached out to me, and I was like, oh, that's, yeah, I'd love to, you know, work with your program. And I started out working with their STARS program, and things just kind of started moving, and there was just interest that I didn't think there was going to be. And it was kind of more just like the opportunities came to me. And I think that there's so many pros and cons with all the different platforms and the different ways you can publish and market your books these days. And for me, I think one of the core things that I just love about Wattpad is that community, is the fact that these people, you know, that are reading my book will interact with me, and they will, one of the cool things Wattpad has is inline comments, which means that they can comment on each paragraph separately. So if they have something they really want to say about this line, they will like, I love this line, or I love that he said this, or this is so funny, or, you know, there are also plenty of people like, oh, I hate this bad guy, he's the worst, you know, and railing against, you know, whatever character, then, you know, luckily the villain, the one I intended them to hate. But there's so much interesting feedback and communication with other people, and people reaching out to me, telling me that like I've affected them in some way, or that, you know, I get a lot of messages from people who are also chronically ill. My first book features a chronically ill character, and I just kind of did that because I hadn't seen anyone that felt like me in these books. You know, I saw a lot of healthy, you know, young women who were like, oh, they're, you know, beautiful and everyone wants them. And I'm like, well, can't they want the unhealthy young woman? You know, like maybe there's something to be said there. And when I did write her, I got so many, you know, personal messages saying like that made me feel really valued, and it made me feel like someone can find me attractive, and someone can, you know, see value in me as a partner beyond, you know, just, you know, that I'm healthy or that I look a certain way, that, you know, she was still, you know, capable, and she still did things, and, you know, he was still in love with her, and she didn't have to be, you know, healthy all the time or tough. And a lot of people have said, oh, I love that you didn't cure her, right? And it was something I explicitly set out to do, because so many stories about people who are sick, they get magically cured and it's all better. And like, yeah, that's nice. And like, I get it. We don't like to, you know, think about sickness. It's one of those things that can kind of bring you down and bring you back into the real world. But I think when you are always telling stories about sick people where they get better at the end, it tells you that, you know, that there's some sort of failure if they don't, that there's some sort of loss to be had if they are, you know, not perfectly better at the end, if they are not fixed, you know, that there is some sort of unresolved thing. And for people who are chronically ill, it is unresolved, and it will be unresolved. And there was certainly some feedback like, oh, I didn't like that was unresolved. I wanted it to be solved. And I get that. I would love my chronic illnesses to be solved. That would be great. But there was much more feedback from people in the chronically ill community that were saying, I love that, because for once it wasn't about fixing her. She was okay the way she was. And, it wasn't about trying to solve her. She just had an adventure and was also sick. And you can be both, and that's okay. And having those interactions with fans and, people telling me like, oh, that meant something to me, that, I'm chronically ill, or my loved one is chronically ill, and I felt seen with that. That was just like, that is exactly why I put my stuff out there, is for those interactions. And that's something that I think is really unique to Wattpad, that level of communication with the individuals reading your book and them being able to say that kind of thing.
What does it mean to be an official Wattpad creator?
Yeah, so Wattpad has their Wattpad Creators program. A while ago, they had something similar that was Wattpad Stars, and they changed it a few years ago to Creators, which is a slightly different program. But it's basically, they select people that have had kind of the right combination of, good readership and community building and relationships with their readers, and people that they feel like, are kind of both good community members and good writers, and they can contribute more in some way, whether it's, through writing paid stories, or they have, various affiliate programs and things like that. So they will reach out to you if they kind of scout you. And I don't know too much about their process, because I think it's, very, very secretive. But in general, it's those kind of select authors that they want to invest more time in.
And is it a requirement that you produce a certain amount per month?
It depends on your contract. I know with my contract, the answer is yes, or was yes during a large portion of my contract. And it's like a weekly requirement, but it depends on, I think, the individual and what contract they've signed and what their particular agreement is.
And how is that to go from loving writing and reading, but then now something that you just thought, oh, I want to try this, and then you found people resonated with it. Now there's a requirement to show up for them. What's the pressure like with that?
Yeah, it's interesting, because I think like the pressure from, like, oh, I have a contract, I have to do, I've agreed to do a certain thing. That's kind of low for me. I'm good with deadlines. I can do that sort of thing. The pressure from fans, I feel like, is like way more intense for me, because I want to make these people happy. They're supportive of me. They're, incredibly kind to me, and they love my reading, and they're so invested in what I do. And so, I will post something, and then within the first 10 minutes, someone will say, I want the next chapter. And it's like, I just posted it. Like, I'm not that fast, sort of thing. But it's kind of, a blessing and a curse, because, I do feel like, oh man, I wish I could produce more. There's always a lot of people asking for more, asking, can you post twice a week? Can you post, 3 times a week? Can you post twice just this week? Sort of thing. And I do my best to accommodate it, because I very much appreciate the investment that my fans have given me. And they, there are a lot of people who, like, they started reading my work when I had nobody reading it and nobody was paying attention to me, and they took a chance on somebody who had no reads and, commented and encouraged me. And like, I do not forget those people. I remember every single one of them. And when people are, so happy about my work and so invested in it, and they're saying nice things, but they're also, there will be weeks when I'm like, oh man, you guys, I'm really sick. I can't post this week. I'm sorry, I will make it up to you. I'll solve it later, sort of thing. And they will always be like, you take care of you, you get better, we're here for you, sort of thing. Like, it is such a welcoming, kind community that I just, like, not necessarily feel indebted to them, but I want to make them happy. I want to bring them things that they enjoy. And, people will tell me like, oh, this is what I look forward to all week, and it makes my day better when you post. And like, I want to be that for people. And so I think that it's a real pressure, but it's also a good pressure in a way, because the fact that I am affecting other people's lives and making them happy, and, I'm able to do that for someone I don't know, or someone across the world who has never met me. It's so much like power that I don't take for granted.
Are you writing a new chapter each week and then releasing it?
So yes and no. I would say the chapter that I'm releasing every week is not the chapter that I wrote that past week. I try to have at least some kind of buffer. My ideal goal is like at least 10 chapters, but sometimes they like gets a little shorter and I'm like, oh no, I got to keep up, sort of thing. But that's in part because I am always kind of tweaking the last few chapters. So I like to have a little buffer in case I want to go back and change something, or, if I realize, oh, I didn't quite set this up in the previous chapters, I want to make sure that that's in there so that they understand when I bring it up here what it means, or that sort of thing. So I like to have that editing room before, even though it is still a working draft, it's one that people are seeing. So I like to have at least the story points really solidified so that I can feel like, okay, I can post that and not need to worry that people who read that and are going to be moving forward are going to be missing something that I have to go back and add later. But those chapters, like the one that I'm posting, this week, it will be a chapter that I wrote many weeks back, but may have edited like up until the last week or so.
How does feedback affect what you write?
I have always been like really grateful for feedback, any feedback. I think it's easy to get very sensitive about feedback when you're making something personal and you're really proud of what you're doing and you're making something great and someone says, oh, I don't like this, or even, oh, what if you did this differently, or maybe I want this sort of thing. There's that kind of knee-jerk instinct to want to say like, no, it's great, I like it. But I have really learned to value all feedback. And I go out of my way to acknowledge and take seriously all feedback. And I will look at it and I will think about it and I will go, oh, they said to change this. And I don't change everything that people suggest I change. But there are times when someone will suggest something and I love that suggestion. And it's a great idea and it adds value, and it's another set of eyes on something I'm creating, and they have good ideas. And so if someone is saying, oh, I wish they had done this, or I wish they had done this, I go, should they have done that? And I will try to take it seriously, even if it's coming from a place where I feel like no, like I had a reason for doing that. And then I will always engage with these people, and if they say, oh, I don't like this character, I think they're being a jerk. Like someone said that in one of these chapters from my first book the other day, and I thought to myself, you know what? I keep thinking that he comes off like more of a jerk in this chapter than I intended for him to come off as. And I basically said that, and I said, every once in a while I think about this chapter specifically and how he comes off more of a jerk than I meant. And when you see like his side, I also wrote as a like bonus chapter, his side of this particular one, it makes sense. But if you don't know what his side is, and readers don't know that until if they were to read that bonus chapter, he does come off as kind of more of a jerk than I meant. I'm like, I might have to change it at some point. That's a good tip. He's not that much of a jerk, I promise. But then there are also things where someone will say, oh, why didn't they do this? And sometimes I have a reason. It's like, oh, I actually thought about that. This is the reason why they wouldn't do that. And it starts a good discussion. Or in a couple instances, people have like said, I don't get it, right? Like, I don't get it. Who is this person? What did they do? Where was this information? And that can be really useful because I can only see my writing through my perspective. So of course I get it. I wrote it. You know, it's very easy for me to acknowledge, you know, all those little details and understand all those little details because I have thought way too much about it. But the reader hasn't necessarily done that, or they don't necessarily have, you know, the background I have. So maybe they didn't watch the show I'm referring to, or maybe, you know, I only mentioned this person once and they haven't come up in a while and they forgot who they are. And I know who they are, but they don't know. And so when they point out like, oh, I'm confused, this doesn't make sense to me, that's great for me because then I can go, okay, what about it doesn't make sense? What's missing here? And when I can put in those extra details and explain to, you know, the readers who don't get it and have that conversation with them, a lot of times that will make my work stronger and easier, you know, on a comprehension level, so that people don't get lost and give up and go like, I'm lost. Who is this person? I don't know what's going on anymore. I'm just going to abandon the book. I can go, oh, like where are you getting lost? And let me help you get back on track. And then your insight can help me, you know, create a more comprehensible book. And so I think it's great to have feedback, and it's not that you don't have to take all the feedback, but it's always worth asking yourself what you can do about it and if you should. And that's what I try to do with any feedback that's given to me is, you know, what can I do from this? What can I learn from it? And is it something that I did intentionally, or did I make a mistake? Is there something I could do better? And a lot of times these things are, you know, good thoughts, or at least good insight to have into what the reader's mind is and what they're thinking about your story and whether or not it's working.
Can you be a Wattpad creator and still be on Amazon?
Yeah, I think my understanding is that everyone kind of has their own specific deal with, you know, what they have coordinated with Wattpad. And it depends on, you know, the book and what they've worked out. But there are many Wattpad creators who, you know, they have some books on Wattpad, some books on Amazon. Some people have them on both. I think it just depends on the specifics of your agreement with Wattpad.
You have millions of views on Wattpad. How does this happen?
I ask myself that a lot. I think that I've just connected with something that people were looking for. I think it kind of came on all at once. It was, you know, once I finished my book and I kind of marked it as complete, there was this kind of steady stream that just kept going up and just kept being more and more interest, and it just was kind of exponential, and it really caught me by surprise because, you know, like I said, I was kind of like, oh, if one person reads my book, that will be nice. And I think what it came down to was that, like, I was trying to create something because I hadn't seen it, and I wanted to. I wanted to see a chronically ill protagonist. I wanted to see, you know, someone do something with the Greek myth Sirens. And, you know, I wanted to see how those things would play out, and I hadn't seen anyone else doing them. And I think in doing so, I found the same gap that a lot of people had. You know, a lot of people were interested in this and couldn't find it. And so I think in making something that I wanted to see and I wanted myself and I saw a lack of, it resonated with so many other people. And there's obviously always going to be some element of luck when it comes to virality and, you know, what people pick up on and really, you know, really love. But I was very lucky that I think I hit on both a topic and multiple topics that people were interested in, and also, you know, good timing and a bit of luck.
And so it wasn't just where, here, let me create something that I know is popular right now. It was something that you really felt personal about. You wanted to see it. You wanted to be a reader of it.
Yeah, I had just kind of really started reading romance, started reading, a lot of these paranormal books, and thinking, like, I wonder why they haven't done a lot of like incubi, and they haven't done sirens, and they haven't done some of these other interesting creatures, because there's so many things beyond vampires and werewolves. Not that I don't love a good vampire and werewolf story, but like, I was wondering what else is out there, what else, why aren't they doing these other things? Because I want to see them and I'm interested in them. And then I, at several points would be reading and thinking like, man, I just don't relate to this main character in this story, because they're off doing all these cool and exciting things. And I'm like, oh, it's hard to get out of bed sometimes. And, like, this doesn't, feel like me. And it got me thinking, how many people are thinking, oh, I am not, good enough, or I am not the love interest. I am not someone falls in love with. I am, the sad, sick friend, or whatever minimal parts, the people were getting in these books. And it's like, I see these gaps and I think, I want those. I want to fill those gaps. I want something to exist in that space. And I think it was just something that I think maybe people didn't know that they wanted, but when they saw it, they went, oh, I want that. That's what I'm looking for. Kind of not necessarily having, knowing what needed to fill the gap, but knowing that there was a gap there. And when I was able to fill it, I think it just got a lot of good response.